I did spend 24 years with Plains Cotton Growers. That was my most recent employment, somebody that actually paid me. I've been working for the last year and a half with my son and for my son, but nobody's paying me there except, what we hopefully can make on the farm, and that's kind of my involvement in this today. I do want to say that anything I say today is not sanctioned by Plains Cotton Growers. I don't work for them anymore. And, I've experienced a lot of things over the last 24 years. And in a lot of that time, I appreciate what Barry said of being able to maybe tell a congressman when he was wrong. I don't know if I actually said you're wrong. I might have challenged what they said, but I didn't flat out say they were wrong. But, I've seen both sides of advocacy work. And lots of times when you're in a position representing a bunch of people that, may have differing opinions, you have to kind of put your own opinion aside. As a guy that used to work for Plains Cotton Growers said, what do you think about something? He said, well, I'm in fact paid not to have an opinion on this. And that's kind of what it was. I had to try to advocate as strongly as I could, but sometimes my personal opinions had to be set aside. That's not going to be the case today. I think that I can speak from a position of observing a lot of things over the last 40 years of my farming career, and then the last nearly 30 years of advocacy and research work on behalf of cotton farmers. I appreciate so much RN leading this off and talking about recognizing commonalities rather than differences. I never thought about being 99.9% like every other human, but it was good to see that. But one of the things I want to talk about today and kind of wrap it up, my job is to kind of wrap up and talk about everything we've learned. Now what do we do with it? How do we go forward in trying to maybe implement some of these things? So I want to talk about facing reality and embracing modification. You hear a lot of times about embracing change. Well, change scares people. Scares me a lot of times. So I decided to choose the word modification. Modifying maybe the way I think or the way I've been doing things. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. Barry mentioned a little bit, I do want to just talk a little bit about my early career. I grew up on a farm in Crosby County. That's what I did until I went off to college. And I started out in agronomy, and my chemistry background was way too weak to be in agronomy. So I'd taken bookkeeping in high school. Accounting kind of come somewhat easy to me, I understand debits and credits, so I ended up getting a degree in accounting. As far as learning about farming or the science of farming or any of that, I didn't learn anything in that regard. I knew what my brother and I had learned and what he had taught me. My brother's 11 years older than me, and so he was much more of a mentor father on the farming operation. But we basically, even though I felt like in the early days we were pretty progressive at farming, but it was progressive in kind of the things we knew, maybe tillage operations, trying to reduce tillage operations, maybe using a disc better instead of a lister, those kind of things. And in all the time in the back of my mind, I realized that there were some things that just didn't look right or didn't seem right. We were farming all of our land, one direction or the other, up and down hills, and every time it'd rain, soil would wash out at the end of the field, and I knew in the back of my mind, dirt would blow and run in sand fighters. I hated the spring worse than any other time of the year because I could never enjoy a good thunderstorm. And I hated it because as soon as you get that rain, it was just like madhouse after that in order to try to protect what crop you had out there. So I knew some of these things weren't right, and so we began experimenting a little bit with, we didn't call them cover crops. It was just basically we'd grow wheat and then maybe summer fallow it and plant cotton into it. Had limited success. But the point I want to make is that all of us, and I think to a great extent even today, we're doing the best with what we have or what we've been taught, what we've come to know. But the fact of the matter is, there are ways that many of us change is not, there's really no reason to change if things are rocking along okay. But when I hear Stephen talk about water running out, we've all been running out of water. And Barry, you know, I've said this for years. I've told my son, you're going to be a dry land cotton farmer one day. May not happen in my lifetime. After listening to Stephen, it may happen in my lifetime. I hope to be around another 10 years anyway. But that's what we're trying to prepare for, is non-irrigated, a sustainable, agronomically sustainable agriculture from a dry land perspective. Irrigation's just kind of helping us make that transition in the meantime. You know, when I think about change or modification, and this has already been talked about, my son Christopher talked about this a little bit. I want to hope it comes from some of our discussions, but there are certain things in life and in farming that we have some ability to influence, limited ability. There's some things, there's no need worrying about them, quite honestly, because they're going to happen. The weather, we can't change that. We just have to work around it. It's what we have to do, for sure. That's one. Input prices, we can play around a little bit with them on some things, but for the most part, those are going to be what they are. Markets, same thing. We can have a little bit of influence, but for the most part, I'm sitting around here watching cotton go down every day over the last, and we're in the price setting time period of doing all this, and so that's not very encouraging. Government policy. There's not a whole lot we can do about that. We have organizations, and I worked in that field for 30 years, and I can tell you that lots of times I'd come home, we'd been to Washington, D.C., and people would ask us, well, did you do any good? And I says, well, it wasn't like in the old days when I'd start plowing on one side of a farm or one side of a field, and when I got done, I could see what I'd accomplished. That wasn't the way it was in working on policy. You'd probably have to drive down a stake to see if you'd move forward. Most of the time, it was one step forward and about two back. But I do believe, I'm a firm believer, we work that it is possible to influence those things, but it's limited. And what I want to point out to you today, here's what I want to say is those things, government policy, crop insurance, the things that have been driving a lot of the agronomic decisions that we're making on our farm today are not going to get any better. And more than likely, they're going to get worse. And it's just, in spite of all the good that Plains cotton growers, Texas cotton producers, the Western peanut growers, Texas wheat, despite everything they're doing, we're going to be doing good to maintain what we have today. And more than likely, as I said, because a number of reasons. One is our nation is broke. And when we, all of us sit around, we look and we think about, well, the government needs to cut somewhere. You know, they need to, at the table last night, somebody spouted off, I won't say who it was, said, we need to look at this Social Security and Medicare. And I said, wait just a damn minute. You know, but, you know, I might throw out here today that, you know, government programs have been means tested for quite some time. Payment limited. Who's to say Social Security shouldn't be means tested? I'm not suggesting that today. I'm not calling AARP up and telling them that's what they need to do or anything, but I'm saying from a government policy standpoint, and we're experiencing it now with some of the last implementation. Those of you that got ERP Phase 1 payments, how many raise your hand if you got an ERP Phase 1 payment? If you're farming, you got one. I guarantee you got one. And it come pretty easy, didn't it? All you had to do is sign up. They sent you a check. Phase 2 was supposed to work just like that. Guess what? It ain't going to. They've moved from a completely different model to basically looking at whole farm revenue, and you're going to have to furnish tax returns to be able to justify whether you qualify or not, and moved away from a crop-by-crop basis to basically whole farm revenue and comparing one year to the next. Well, we all know that most farmers that are cash accounting, that can easily not reflect what actually took from one year to the, or what it meant on that farm. So my point is, and this is being done conscientiously, not accidentally, because ERP Phase 1 was probably implemented as easy as any pro was. So you would think they'd just turn around and do the same thing because of their employees, but the deal is that we're hearing much more about all this, that 90% of the farmers are only getting 10% of the payment. And 10% of the farmers are getting all the payment. Well, we've made the case for years that those same 10% are the ones producing the goods. And everybody's getting the same payment per acre. But there's people that feel like those folks, that's larger number of people, are being left behind. And there's a great deal of support for those kind of ideas. I only point that out to just say, it ain't getting better, guys. And this is under Republican and Democrat. I've seen it for 25 years. It doesn't make any difference. I'm not trying to be political today saying it's all the Democrats' fault, because that's not the case. It's both administrations. So, with all that being said, what we can't change and what we might have limited change on, what are those things that we can have some influence on? One, I'd say, is agronomic decisions. We've talked a lot about that here today. I mentioned about crop insurance a little bit. We've heard a little bit about that. Big believer in crop insurance. I think it's very important. But, I think we got to be looking towards, and I visited with Stephen last night a little bit at dinner, that his goal is basically, within a number of years, to be able to farm without a government program or crop insurance. Now, that sounds pretty scary to me. But I think we better be thinking in that direction. And when we talk about those agronomic decisions, when I've talked to some people who says, well, what we've been doing has always worked, and so why do I need to change? Well, part of the reason it's always worked is because of the government infusion that's coming in to agriculture today. That's the reason it's working. And also, if it's working so well from an agronomic position, then why, as Stephen pointed out for Gaines County, are our yields continuing to go down? I looked at the 2023 stacks yields for cotton. That's all I know to talk about. I don't know about corn or grain sorghum or anything else, but I'm talking about cotton. Stacks yields or county yields that really pretty well estimate what the capability is in that county to grow cotton. It's really a generous number. It's a long term. Most of our counties that have data, it goes back to 1990, 1991. So it's a long-term trend yield. And when I say trend yield, it's not adjusted down, it's adjusted if technology comes along, different things happen, they'll tend to put a trend on it and trend it up a little bit. And there's even a provision that if some anomaly comes along, they see something kind of out of whack, and the 5-year Olympic average in a county is better than what that trend is, they'll put the 5-year Olympic average in. So when I talk about these yields, these are not, and they're county yields, and I know there's going to be people in this room that's got better than county yields, but there are going to be some that's going to have worse, because an average is something in the middle, and that's what it would tell you. I just looked for 2023, the stacks yields for cotton, in the 14 counties that are primarily have had a lot of dry land cotton over the last many years. All the counties from Lubbock, east and west and south, down to Andrews County, 14 counties. Are there any guesses as to what the dry land stack yield, average dry land stack yield for those 14 counties is? 230 pounds. Who in here can grow dry land cotton and make money at 230 pounds? There's 6 counties of those 14 that have greater than 200 pounds. Excuse me, less than 200 pounds. Less than 200 pounds. The lowest county, and I'm not going to tell you who it is, well, it's public. Lowest is Gaines County, 153 pounds. There's 5 counties that's greater than 250 pounds. Nothing 300. The highest is 286 pounds in Dickens County. So I say all this, that if what we're doing is working, why do we have these yields? Now, I'm not going to stand up here and try to tell people that all the problems we got from rain or lack of rain or whatever is because of climate change. I'm going to leave that for somebody else to argue about. But I can tell you this, that I know that our climate, our growing seasons have changed tremendously from when I was in high school in the 70s. Now, I know we've got better varieties. We have better methods of growing cotton and stuff, but it was a rarity in my early farming days, certainly in high school, that we ever defoliated cotton. It wasn't because we were cheap and didn't want to spend the money. It was because, quite frankly, we needed every day we could get before a freeze to hopefully mature everything out, because we always had a wet, cool September. The growing seasons have changed. Now, I could make the argument that if we stick around long enough, they'll go back the other way. But all we can work with is what we know in the recent past and maybe what it's going to look like in the near future. And so this is where we got to somehow modify our behavior is what we got to do. And I think we've heard some good things here today. I think about, I was actually off the farm full time. It's when I was working for Plains Cotton Growers. And my son wasn't even out of high school yet, but I've referred to this to a lot of people that it was the golden age for cotton, the late 90s to the 2010s. And that was the introduction of Roundup Ready cotton, new varieties that had much more yield potential, and all of us forgot how to farm because we could farm more land and we can do it with a 120-foot boom. We could kill any weed, thigh-high, graveyard dead. And that lasted for quite a while, up until I was looking that I think, pigweed resistance first showed up in the southeast. And I can remember all of us talking and discussing, even the weed scientists saying, well, that's the southeast. They get a lot more rain than we do. And, we use residuals, which we wasn't using. That's part of the problem, what happened. And we're not going to have that here. Well, lo and behold, in about 2010, it showed up in the southern high plains of Texas. And the rest is history. And we had a system set up where all of us were farming more acres with less people, and we didn't know how to change. And ever since that day, I would say most farmers have still been looking. We heard about that silver bullet, remember? We still been looking for that next silver bullet Roundup chemical that's going to solve all our problems. We couldn't wait for dicamba to come along because we thought that was going to be it. Even though most weed scientists told us It's not going to last. It's not going to work. We've already seen resistance in some of the corn areas. So that's what has led that golden age of cotton that we all benefited from has now come home to roost. And we're all trying to figure out how we're going to manage. How are we going to do? How are we going to handle, whether it's weed resistance, whether it's less water, whether it's less rainfall, whatever it may be, how are we going to come up with a system that's going to be agronomically sustainable? And how are we going to make decisions that are going to be agronomically sustainable and going to work regardless about whether it's crop insurance or farm programs? Christopher mentioned about those of you that had done anything on wide row cotton understand that the crop insurance rules today, basically, it goes by FSA rules. FSA rules, any skip wider than 40 inches becomes skip row, is not planted as cotton. So if you're planting 80-inch cotton, it's 50% planted. Irrigation, there's no yield factors like there is in dry land. Now, if you plant dry land 80-inch cotton, there's a yield factor. I think it's like 1.14, I think. But we don't even think about the yield factor when it comes to all this. I mean, we're just trying to figure out how can we get the most. But you come up with a year like this last year when it's dry, we've already heard about this full profile that we need to have. Even though we may believe that 80-inch cotton is going to have the best chance if we have a dry year, or it turns out, even if it starts off wet and then turns out dry, if it's real dry to begin with, and I'm looking at my risk management, how much 80-inch dryland cotton am I going to want to plant? I'm going to want to plant 40-inch cotton, even though it may not be the best agronomic decision to make. Well, somehow that needs to be changed. In my opinion, you ought to be able to plant cotton. If you've got 100 acres of land, you can plant it however you want to plant it. And you're going to insure 100 acres, is what it amounts to, within reason. You can't go out there, Siggy, and plant 2 rows on 100 acres and count that as solid planted. That'd catch up with you sooner or later, but there's got to be some boundaries. But, we've heard about 60s, we've heard about 80s, 90s. Tate's even done some 120s. There needs to be something, and that is one area of policy whether it's Plains cotton growers or others that can work, and there are some attempts being made to make some changes in that. Now, here I'm the typical farmer. I thought about this early on. I said, we need to change this to land acres. And then after I get a crop up and going, and I'm thinking, I really don't need that risk management like I had before. It's only early when I may want to fail that out and I need that fully insured. But once I'm going to carry it to harvest, what's so bad about this only paying insurance on half the acres and doubling your yield? Not such a bad deal, is it? But it's that early risk that we have a lot of problem with here, and bankers, landowners, this is difficult. Now that's kind of where I want to finish, because there's plenty. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion as well. But back to this, what we can change, or what we have some limited ability to change. And that's every time I talk to anybody, or we talk about wide row, or we talk about whatever it is, making, changes from the norm, no-till, whatever it might be, whatever you might want to do. Well, I visit with people and they say, my landowner's never going to go for that deal. And that's another thing I want to mention. I'm on a crusade. I don't like the word landlord. They're landowners. And I'm the operator, and we're partners. This is not a feudal system. And any landowner that feels like that's what they need to be is feudal, then they need to find somebody else to operate their land, as far as I'm concerned. Now, that aside, what we have found, most farmers are scared to sit down with a landowner and really look them eye to eye and try to explain some of this. And what I've found is that if you can't explain, if you don't have it in your own heart or your own brain that what you want to do, you ain't going to have any chance. But if you don't ever go talk to them, you're sure not ever going to have a chance. And what I found, and we've had some difficult conversations, but what I found, if you have a little bit of data or you have some reason, because some of this stuff is still unknown, that what we're trying to do, whether it's from the soil health side, how are you going to prove to anybody, Dr. Zach, that your soil health is really getting any better, unless you can get them out there to come out in the field and look. And I've found also some of them are willing to do that. They like to do that. But you just have to be able to sit down and cogently explain and calmly explain why you want to do this and what it means for them and their investment of their farmland. You know, when I hear this deal about farmers are the best environmentalists in the world because they have to make a living off this land, that's a bunch of baloney. Some farmers are. But we all know, we've got neighbors, we've seen them. There's some of these people don't care about the land, or they wouldn't do the things they do. And that's cold, hard truth, but that's the way it is. And so we got to be able to demonstrate and really show that we are those true environmentalists, and it does mean something to us to leave this earth better and this land better, and for that landowner, which is their investment, it should mean something to them that it's in as good or better shape than when you started farming it. I'd like to say it'd be in better shape. So you got to have those hard conversations. And I think about some of the presentations we had, especially Dr. LaSalle's presentation today. And, you know, we all generally in the back of our mind know about what's going on in other parts of the world, but we tend to choose to ignore it, or basically say it's not in my backyard and I don't have to worry about that. But the point that he made today was, can't remember exactly how he said, was when he come back home. Not when he was there, but when he came back home. Do what? Culture shock. Culture shock, that's right. The culture shock was not when he was in all of those countries, especially South Africa or Africa, but was when he come back home. And my point is that, you know, and going forward, as one other speaker also mentioned about, there's only two things that cause change, and one is fear and one is desire. And I want to say, you know, one is empathy as well. And I think that when I think about the challenges that lots of people face around the world, people that work, like Dr. LaSalle and the hard work that he did, and I think about that it's hard for me to want to get up the courage to go talk to a landowner so that I can do a better job of farming for him and for me. It's not even in the same realm at all. And so, you know, I want to close. And Dr. Zach, I didn't tell you I was going to steal this from you. But this was another thing that hit home with me was Dr. Zach's one last question. In whose image do we work or use and subsequently transform the ecological systems around us? Are we mindful of the deeper connections that are necessary for ecological systems to function without all the inputs from humans to keep them working? And then the last thing, we need to think about that. And then the last thing, it hit me while I was sitting out here this morning about Scripture, and I always, you know, I think about things. I don't know if they come from the Bible sometimes or Benjamin Franklin said them. And so it's a good thing about having a phone. You can put it into Google and you can find out pretty quick. So I kind of knew what I wanted to look for. But it's Luke 12, the last half of verse 48. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. We've been entrusted with an awful lot. And I want to be able to meet my Maker and say that I've done everything I can to make it better. And so I hope you've taken this in the spirit that it was given, and not to be critical or harsh, but to just challenge all of us to modify our behavior in ways that we can. And so I thank all of you for being here today, and I look forward to our panel for questions to be asked if people really find out some answers on some things. Thank you all very much.